Hi everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to deploy Cisco Firewall Threat Defense Virtual, the FTDv, in KVM running on Ubuntu version 22.04 using the Virt-Manager, the GUI manager for managing virtual machine or the KVM setup, right? You can also use the virtual installer, right, which is a command line based tool that allows you to install using command line. But for this tutorial, we're going to look at using the Virt-Manager from a GUI base, right, which in my view is a lot easier to understand and troubleshoot, right? Whereas the virtual installer is usually much faster, right, if you have the template ready. Okay, so let's take a look at how the setup will look like. So we already have the KVM installed in Ubuntu. We have a public connection through virtual bridge 0. What we're going to do, we also have the couple of other bridge that is already set up, the virtual bridge 1 running 172.16.1.1 is my IP address that I'm using for the outside interface of the FTDv, that it does network address translation for going out into the internet. So you can see it's like a two-tier firewall whereby IP tables in front and then FTDv behind. We'll not touch on how to configure the IP tables for this tutorial. Today's tutorial is really focusing on installing the FTDv and then getting the connection out to the internet to work. So for the inside, which is the LAN behind the FTDv, we have Virtual Bridge 2 with IP address 172.16.2.x Class C subnet. Right? You will notice that there is different virtual bridge definition. So by default, the system virtual bridge starts from 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 and onwards. However, for the KVM, you can actually define a name that is much longer. So you can see that I have actually defined like virtual bridge 172.16.01 to stand for 172.16.1, right, as the name, so that when I start configuring multiple firewalls for testing HA and clustering, it's easier for me to troubleshoot. Okay, and then I will also have a client that is configured with static IP address of 172.16.2.199 that we'll be using to manage the FDM. And then once the setup is done, we will be able to use the client to access the internet. Okay, so that's pretty much a high-level view of how the setup will look like. So now let's move over to the VNC that I've already launched to my KVM in the cloud, right? So this is my lab that I've set up in the cloud. So you will see a lot of the public IP address, and we can test this, using public IP addresses, especially when we start to look at VPN, site-to-site VPN, or even remote access VPN, right? Just to get a feel of how the setup will be like in a real environment, and of course without the restriction of sometime the ISP net, I believe it's net 444, which hinders a lot of the testing, especially for port forwarding. Okay, so now first let's take a look at what are the IP addresses that we have assigned. So just to check, I want to show virtual bridge 0. So you can see that we have IP address assigned to this. If we look at IP address, show virtual bridge 1, you can see is configured with 172.1.1, and then virtual bridge 2 is 172.16.2.1, right? So this is how the setup will look like. Now that we're done with that, let's hop over to the Virt-Manager. You can launch the Virt-Manager from the terminal itself. So once there, what first thing we need to do is just start creating a new virtual machine. By now you should have downloaded the image from the Software Central from Cisco with the CCID that gives you permission to do that. So once you've done that, you can upload the QCOW image into the server, and then we can start to import this image. So the way that we're doing this install is actually using the QCOW image that is provided by Cisco. So once we click on create a new virtual machine, the first thing we want to do is to select import existing this image, click on forward, look for the image, right? I've renamed the image to YouTube FTDv. Okay, so then next you can select generic or unknown OS. Next, so there is a minimum requirements for the FTDv, right? You need at least 8 gig of RAM and 4 CPU. Okay, let's do that. Let's give it a name. Okay, now before you click finish over here, make sure you select customize configuration before install, because if you read the documentation, there are a few things that you need to make sure that you have set up, right? Especially you need at least I believe 4 in network interface port to be configured, although I've never really used a 4th port. Not too sure why, in the documentation they did highlight that you need at least 4 ports, right? So it might have changed, but we're going to stick with that to add 4 network port to the virtual machine. So once you select the customize before installation, we can click on finish. Okay, over here you can leave the this bus as ID, or you can follow the documentation to change it to virtual IO. We're gonna do virtual IO for this. On the NIC interface, we want to make sure that the inside interface are on the same subnet. That's part of the documentation. You might be able to change them after your initial setup, but for a start, I believe your management and your inside interface should be on the same subnet at least, right? So let's select. So the first network interface is usually management. Okay, let's select that as the inside, which is 172.16.2. Let's apply that. Next, let's add another network card. The second network port that you add is actually the outside interface, which is 172.16.1. So let's do that. And then let's add the rest of the diagnostic and the inside port, right? So let's add that. So it should be in the same subnet as your management LAN, which is 172.16.02. And then the last port is usually the diagnostic port, which is also added to the inside network. Right, finish. Okay, so once that's done, that's pretty much the main hardware that you need to have for your setup. Now, if you have figure a way to configure your virtual manager to allow you to select telnet as your, or TCP telnet as your device type, then you can just go ahead and select that, right? I haven't really figured out how to do that, so I found the manual way to do it. I'll show you how to do it. So first, let's add the serial port. Okay, and then hop over to the XML. Okay, I've enabled XML editing, so you don't see an error. If not, you need to go to the preference and turn on XML editing for you to be able to edit this file. So I've already made a copy of that in a notepad, so I can just copy and then paste it over here. Right, so what effectively we are doing is to specify the serial type as a TCP protocol connecting to the local host using port 1667 through telnet, right? So I might have used this .1 already. You can actually use any of the localhost IP addresses that have not been used, right? So we're going to use dot 16, right? Let's use dot 16, right? And then apply. Okay, so once you've done that, right, you can then click on begin installation, right? So let's do that. Okay, it will allocate the div storage to the virtual machine. Okay, I have also not figured out a way to configure the VNC console to, allow you to have TTY kind of access, right? There are probably ways to do it, but it's pretty tedious. So I'm going to go with the telnet way, right? So if you remember, we've configured serial through telnet on 127.0.0.16 on, I believe, 16677. Okay, looks like I've made a correct guess. Okay, yep, you will see the initial boot over here. Okay, but once it hit a certain part of the process, right, you will lose the view of the what is happening on the VNC display, right? So that's why that the telnet, serial telnet is important. Okay, it takes about between 5 to 15 minutes to do the initial deployment, which they verify the file systems. It does a lot of checks. So I'm going to pause the video and then come back when this deployment of the initial QCOW image is done. Okay, once the installation completes, you will see a Firepower login, right? Or the name of the that you have given to your FTD. So the default username is admin, and the default password is admin123, capital admin123. Okay, so let me just write it down. So username is admin, password is admin capital DMIN123. So username admin, password admin123. Okay. So let's log in. Oops. Butterfinger admin capital ADMIN123. Okay. You'll be prompted to accept the EULA, the end user license agreement. We're gonna accept that, and then it will prompt you if you're logging in for the first time to reset your password, right? So follow the criteria for password selection. Okay, once you enter that, there will be an initial configuration wizard for you to configure the management interface, right? So we're going to do that using IPv4. We're not configuring IPv6 right now. We'll do a manual configuration. The IP address is 172.16. Oops. .2.45 for my management interface. Subnet is class C/24. And then the default gateway, we're going to set it to the inside IP address of the FTDv that we're going to configure, which is .2.1, right? So, no, actually, it will be a conflict. My apologies. Let's set it to .2, right? Okay, and then let's give it a name. 3001. Okay, and then the DNS name server, It's default to the umbrella DNS, so you can use that. It's by default, the DNS will protect you. So if you don't have any violent objection, just enter and choose that umbrella DNS. We don't have any such domain right now for local resolution, so we're going to enter. That's all you need to configure for the wizard, right? It takes a while for the configuration to take effect, and then we're going to manage it locally right now through the FTM, right, which is the Firewall Device Manager. We'll look at CDO in the future. It's definitely a good web-based management for FTD if you have a couple of them that are installed in multiple locations. Okay, so this configuration is very similar to the hardware appliance. It's just that for the hardware appliance, you need to use the console cable to console into the appliance itself, but the setup config is pretty much the same. Okay, so once you select yes, it will configure the firewall mode to routed, right? So transparent mode has a few other criterias, and depending on your need, right, the configuration is slightly different. But for basic setup, this is what you need to do to get your FTD or your firewall threat defense device up and running. Once that's done, you'll see a greater than sign. If you show network, you should see that whatever you have configured being shown over there, right? So DNS server, the name of the host name. If you're using FMC, then you need to also make sure that H305 is open. We're not, so that's fine, right? Default gateway was set to .2.2, and then the management IP is set to 172.16.2.4. Okay, so that's pretty much what you need to do on the console itself. We've not configured any proxy. If you have proxy, you just you can initiate the proxy wizard to configure the proxy as well. Okay, so that's pretty much what we need to do on the command line, right? For those who love command line, for the newer firepower or the firewall, next gen firewall that Cisco has, you don't really need to configure on the command line anymore. There's still some commands you can use to troubleshoot on the command line, but most of the configuration should be done in the GUI based interface. Okay, so let's close the terminal. As you can see, the VNC console, we can't really do anything. I haven't figured this out. Maybe one day we'll, figure out how to get the VNC console working. Okay, once that's done, we're pretty much done with the initial deployment. Now let's hop over to the client machine. I have a Windows 11 that has been pre-configured. Okay, with the inside IP address .2.199. This is a static configuration. My gateway, I'll need to change that later. Initially, I was planning to do 112, but we'll change it back to .2 later, or even use the DHCP to get the IP address for the client. Okay, what you need to do is just launch a browser from the client that is connected to the internal inside interface for a physical environment, and then let's just issue the IP address of the management port. Oops. .45. Okay, it takes a while for the FDM to be fully initiated. Okay, so let's type. Remember your new password that you have set. Let's make this a little bit smaller so we can configure. Okay, so it seems that the FDM is deployed already, but usually when you just freshly install, it takes about a couple of minutes for the FDM to fully initialize. Okay, so you can see all the cables inside, outside is virtually connected, so they're up. So what we need to do is that when you first log in, right, to the GUI, there is a setup wizard. You can use the wizard to set it up. I recommend doing that for those that are new, because it will also automatically create the net and access control rule, right? So if you are familiar with the FDM, then you can just skip this and do it manually yourself. But for this tutorial we're going to go through it like a beginner, right? So the outside interface is .1.2, which is what we have set, right? For the outside interface IP address, subnet mask 255.255.255.0/24, and then our default gateway should be 172.16.1.1. So this is our outside, right? So remember that. And then once you do that, click on next. Thing in if you're upgrading from 7.2.0 to 7.3.0, or if you're doing it brand new installation without the hotfix, there are some issue with the IP address string, right? So do check out the release notes to see, or the bug search to see what are the steps you can do if you hit into the error. Let's hope I don't hit into this. Okay, so it looks good, right? It takes a few minutes. The good thing I love about the Firewall Device Manager is that, it's really modern looking, very much object-oriented kind of GUI. The only improvement that, I hope Cisco will do is, make it a little bit faster for the deployment. I believe there's a lot of checks that goes behind, especially now they are keeping track of change requests, and then of course doing the internal checks to make sure that there are less issues, conflicts, or even bugs, right? So it takes a while for the deployment to complete, right, or the changes to apply. Okay. Okay, so I pause the video for a short while it completes. So once the configuration goes through for the outside, you can see that the gigabit Ethernet 00, which is our outside interface, right, should be set up, right, with and then you will see that the internet connection to the internet should be established. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now let's set the time zone. I am in Singapore, so let's scroll down to my time zone, UTC +8. Click on next. You can change to your own name's NTP server, but we're going to use the default. Okay, so it's done. It will take a while for the machines to get synced up with the NTP server. That's fine. Right, Cisco is pretty generous for the evaluation license these days. It gives you a 90 days evaluation period without the need for registration, whether you are doing FDM or even if you are doing CDO integration, right? So it's pretty good for deployment as well as for you to test out in your lab environment. So we're using FTDv10, right? V5 has a rate limit of, I believe, 500 meg, and then V10 has a rate limit of 1 gig, right? Which is what I will be using, right? And there's a VPN limit of 250. I mean, at the end of the day, the limit is really to try and reduce the impact in terms of performance, right? So once that's done, you can click on finish. If you have bought your license for your FTD or FTDv, you can go ahead and register using Smart Software Manager as well. So, but for this tutorial, we're using trial. Let's complete this installation. Once the registration setting is done, should be quite fast. Okay, you'll be prompted whether you want to manage the device using Cloud Manage CDO or standalone. Right, for a start, get yourself familiar with the standalone. You can configure most of the things that you need to do using standalone. You can then also straight away configure your internal device through this wizard, or you can just finish the wizard installation and then go over to your interface and configure your inside IP address manually. So default, the boxes comes with 192.168.45.1 for the inside and 45 for the management interface. So if you are not changing any of this, remember that default. For us, we're going to change it to 172.16.2.2, right? Is where our IP address is, and then edit the DHCP pool. Right, we don't really need that big a pool, so I'm going to just assign 55 IP addresses, 16.2.254. Okay, click on OK, and we're done with the basic default configuration, right? So the good thing about the FDM or CDO, it actually allows you to review your configuration, right? It tells you what are the changes that you're doing. We're changing the IP address from the inside to the new 172.16.2.2. We have a new DHCP pool address. Once you review it, click OK, and then click on the deployment again. Okay, bear in mind, I'm connected over a slow WAN connection and running on a virtualized environment. Sometimes add on to the deployment slowness. Okay, so it's deploying. You can click on here to see the deployment history as well. Okay, it will tell you, the automatic deployment has finished. You can look at the difference in terms of the changes that you have done, right? So by default, it actually completes all the default configuration as well. Okay, and then you can click on deploy now to deploy the changes that we have done, right? So when it's initially starting out, it's a little bit busy. So give you a little bit of time, right? And you will set up everything properly. So it takes a few minutes to deploy the policy. So this is the part that, I hope Cisco will improve, right? So that, the deployment time can be much faster. Okay, we'll pause while it deploys, and then we'll come back when it finishes. Okay, the deployment is done. You should see that, complete the checkbox and nothing to deploy. Click on OK. So that's pretty much all it takes to quickly spin up your firewall threat defense, FTD or FTDv, right? If you have gone through the wizard, what you need to take note is that by default, so we can see everything in one screen, it will create a net rule whereby a dynamic net rule a dynamic net rule from the inside outside, which to allow all traffic from inside any IPv4 address. You can customize this going to any destination, any port, doing a port address translation, a dynamic path, right, through the outside interface to any of the external IP address, right? So that is the net rule, and then they will also at the same time create a trust rule that allows inside to go outside, right? So in the configuration, whether you are doing a external net or internal net, right, that we have seen, these are the two rules that you usually need to configure, right? In the subsequent video, I'll show you how to do port forwarding as well. But the net rule nets the outgoing traffic to the outside interface. The access rule allows all traffic from the inside to go out to the internet, right? So these are the two rules that will be created by default. Now, if you have skipped the installation wizard, remember to come in and configure these two rules, right, for the inside client to be able to access the internet. So now that we're done with the configuration, we can go over to our client, right? So now we can actually change the IP address. I actually do have two DHCP running at the same time, so it's not recommended. So let's see whether my client will be able to get the IP address from the um, FTD itself. Okay, so this is the new Windows 11 interface. Not exactly the best interface in the world. Okay, so let's go to the properties. As you can see, I have previously done the manual. Actually, let's do a manual trial first, right? So let's go to properties, and then let's manually change this to the firepower gateway. Close. Okay, and then let's go back to the browser, and then let's try to go to google.com. As you can see, it is actually being translated. So the internet is working. So we are now surfing the web going through the FTDv itself. Okay, now let's go back and change this to a DHCP and see if we still get the IP address from the FTDv. Like I said, I do have two DHCP server running on the same VLAN or the same bridge. So let's see which IP address do I get. Okay, looks like I'm getting from FTDv. Okay, so that's great. Okay, DNS server not getting IP address. Let's see if I can ping. Okay, so there seems to be because I have two DHCP scopes, so I usually run into this problem. So if you hit into this problem, you can either disable the DHCP, the other DHCP that is running, or you can just come here and then manually key in the umbrella DNS IP address, which is 208.67.220.220. Okay, click on OK. OK. Then let's go back to ping. You should see that the IP address is being resolved. Okay. So if we come back here and look for FTDv, we can surf the internet, right? Chat. GPT, which is the latest topic. We'll go through one of tutorials to look at using ChatGPT to do installation and see how that stands, right? So far, it's pretty okay. It does help people who have some fundamental knowledge, right? It does help, right? It's not going to replace us anytime soon, but it does definitely help make our work easier. Okay, so that's pretty much all that is to deploy the FTDv in KVM, in Ubuntu in the cloud, right? Configuring the interfaces, going through the wizards, and then getting the FTDv to work. So that's pretty much what I have for this short tutorial. Right, stay tuned for the future tutorial where we look at CDOs, port forwarding, and a lot more on Cisco Secure Firewall. Thank you very much for watching, and take care and stay safe.